Brothers, what do you think is the biggest misconception that white evangelicals would have about immigrant communities in the United States?
Well, one, I would say that not all immigrants are undocumented. So sometimes when we think about immigrants, we say, well, they must be illegal.
Okay.
And I think that's not the case.
Another misconception, perhaps, would be that 60% of Hispanics, in this case, are second and third generation. Only 30% of them are first generation. And within that 30%, only 49% of first generation immigrants are professionals who are coming with visas. So when we talk about the issue of immigration, specifically within the Hispanic community, the biggest misconception is that all of them are perhaps illegal. All of them are coming from Mexico, and that's not true. 60%, 63% of them are second and third generation, meaning that they are born here. So,
if I may, I was talking with a pastor in Georgia, in northern Atlanta, and he was expressing to me, he said, sometimes people think that all immigrants, they speak Spanish. He said, I was called as a pastor by Georgia State Convention. He said, we have 1,000 refugees here. Come, talk to them, minister to them. He said, I would love to go and share the gospel. So he went. But they didn't speak Spanish. They were from Guatemala. They spoke a dialect. So he was unable to minister to them because they didn't speak Spanish. So those things happen because of course, Spanish is the main language in Latin America. But like in Mexico, we have more than 50 dialects or languages, only in Mexico. So the same you can see in Central America. So that's another misconception that we have experienced here in the U.S.
So how do you, when you're doing ministry with immigrant communities, how do you make sure you're doing the right kind of ministry when you do have people who are in widely different situations? So if someone who is new in this country, say from El Salvador, doesn't speak English yet, is in a completely different situation from, say, a third generation Cuban immigrant in South Florida.
I think that you need to approach it from a macro level and then from a micro level. I think that every church should seek reconciliation and integration, but at the same time you have the issue of language. On that sense, then you have to address that on the micro level. You should have people in your church staff who speak the language that could address their particular realities, which are vastly different, even from second, third generation. Each country is different. Even within the Hispanic context, there are 21 countries, 40 plus different cultures. So I'm from Puerto Rico, he's from the Dominican Republic. Even though we come from the same region, our cultures are different. So I think that another misconception is that people tend to group immigrants into one pot, and that becomes problematic. So,
what about undocumented immigrants in the community? Say you're in a ministry situation, someone comes to faith in Christ, but he's not documented. How do you think through how to disciple that person from that point forward?
That's a complex question. Because I think first you want to be intentional about engaging them with the gospel. You want to be to that. At the same time, you want to understand where they're coming from, what is the situation. For example, I met a family. They came here because we cannot assume all of them came because of the same reason. One of them came from Mexico, and they came here because their house was, in some sense, taken by drug trafficking ring. So they came here because otherwise they would be killed. So all that, because sometimes when we talk about this, and I have been thinking about this because I have changed my mind a little bit. Because sometimes when we think about it, we think about this number of people. But when you go there and you see faces and people that are suffering, and what happened to you? Well, I was persecuted there. So all that kind of bring a lot of passion and nuances to the discussion. So I think I was talking with a group of pastors recently about that. I said, how you do that? I said, well, I want to minister to them to the gospel. I want, as a church, as a body of believers, we want to show them mercy, grace that we have received in Christ. We sometimes supply them with food, clothing, what we can. And we want to be intentional about them, like sharing the gospel, to see that we do this not because for any particular reason, but because of Christ or because of the grace that we have received. And in that sense, this pastor, I remember he was saying to me, Edgar, I talked to them and I told them, I tried to disciple them and give them a view of redemption and global mission, so that maybe God brought them, and if they go back, that they can be also people that will be evangelizing their friends back home if they go back. So all that has to be brought into the discussion, and I think we have to be intentional about that.
I also believe that, and this would be encouraging for believers to understand that before we address the topic of immigration or any racial issue, we need to address the topic of identity. Most evangelicals in the context of U.S. view themselves first and foremost as Americans, right? So Christ saved me, and then Christianity becomes a moral framework by which we live and are preserved. But if you follow that to the logical conclusion, you will realize that it is utterly unbiblical. My demarcation point is Rúben Cabrera, and I am a son of God. Why am I a son of God? Because I've been adopted into the family of God. Why have I been adopted into the family of God? Because Christ purchased me with his blood. That sense, Revelation 5:9, right? By his blood, he purchased a people from every tribe and every tongue and every nation. What does that mean? That you, who came from Dominican Republic, were purchased by the blood of Christ. Therefore, you were adopted into the family of God. Russell, you were born in the United States, but you were purchased by the blood of Christ. Therefore, adopted into the family of God. What does that make us? That makes us family. In the context of the local church, that's how we should approach our brothers and sisters. You are my brother. You are my sister. If we begin the conversation from that lens, things will be better. Yeah. I think the animosity and the wall of hostility will be eradicated because we're coming from equal levels. Yeah. And I think that should be considered.
And I think we also need to take into account how Romans 13 functions as it applies to immigration. Because so many times people think, well, you have someone who's breaking the law, and so if someone came to me and said, I'm a thief and I want to be saved, then we would say, go and pay back what you've stolen and stop stealing. But when it comes to the immigration system, you have a much more complex situation of the law, because the United States government is saying, on the one hand, keep out, where we want to keep the border secure, but on the other hand, come in. And so the United States government is itself really dependent upon people crossing the border and coming in. So I think you're exactly right. When you're dealing with that person, you're dealing with first of all, a person created in the image of God. And secondly, you're dealing with a situation that is more morally complex than simply the question of whether that person has broken the law or not. And that's one of the reasons why the system is broken and needs to be fixed.
And I think that when we talk about Romans 13, we have to be very careful. If we trace the history of immigration in the United States from 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the driver of the establishment of immigration law in the U.S. was racism, right? So yes, in one hand, we have to look at Romans 13 and say, yes, I agree with that. But if we follow that logic, did we apply Romans 13 to Jim Crow? Did we apply Romans 13 to black coats? Did we apply Romans 13 to slavery, right? So I'm not saying that we should not have immigration law. I am for immigration laws. But the system that we have currently is broken, as like you said. So I think that it needs to be fixed. It needs to be more fair.
What would you say, very briefly, that a pastor should do if he's trying to reach immigrant communities in knowing that they would find a welcome place in his congregation?
I think that we should follow biblical command. Welcome them, embrace them, love them, feed them, take care of them, and see them as your brothers and sisters. I think that if we teach our congregation to start from a biblical perspective, right, from an identity perspective, they are brothers and sisters. We should not treat them any differently.
Yeah, and something that I would use from a more practical way that I have experienced, like I was talking with a group of pastors in Western North Carolina, and they would say, well, you know, we hear great intentions. They say, we want to reach the community. We went to the high school, and we went to the youth group, to the children, and we were reaching them, giving them. What happened is that the way that the Hispanic culture is structured, you don't go to the children, you go to the parents. Because if not, you will be creating kind of a rebellion in the house. So talk to the old people because they have some kind of moral authority. You don't go to the children. So I want to understand how they think. Because sometimes we have great intention, and I think a lot of churches that make mistakes, not just because they don't understand the culture, how people think, their mindset. And I think we should try to be informed and ask a friend, how should I do this? And I think there are plenty of people that are willing to help and to contribute to that.
That's a good point. Well, thank you, brothers, for this good conversation.
Thank you.